If I were to tell you a story about a race between a donkey and an elephant, a really close race in which the winner, the elephant, came in second, and the loser, the donkey, came in first, you might be suspicious. And if I were to continue by saying that the donkey lost because, well, the race is counted by not by the seconds elapsed, but rather by the number of counties the runner visits, you might eventually realize that my story is really about the 2016 US presidential race. Or how about a story about an eagle and a bear who were competing to see who could be the first one onto the moon? First, the bear throws a rock out into orbit. Then the eagle throws himself onto the moon. You might think, have I heard this before? But if you're getting the hang of how this works, you'd realize that this story is really about the Cold War between Russia and the US and their race to be the first one to the moon. Both are examples of allegories, where characters and objects within a story have a one to one correspondence with meanings outside of the narrative. The enjoyable part about exploring allegories is our role as a reader, trying to figure out who or what each character represents. Sometimes interpreting an allegory requires a little detective work, and when it all comes together, there's usually that aha moment, which is often delightful, but in some cases, allegories create a moment of dread. Take, for example, one of the most well known allegories in the Bible, the story uh, shared by Nathan to David after the king's affair with a married woman named Bathsheba. Nathan tells a compelling tale about a shepherd who had only one sheep. The shepherd raised this sheep like a member of his own family, gave it food from his meager means, even allowed the sheep to sleep in his own bed. Then Nathan introduces a rich man, a man who had many sheep. When a stranger comes to the land and wanders into this rich man's presence, the rich man takes the poor man's single sheep and slaughters it for this stranger to eat. Upon hearing this story, which David thinks really happened, the king burns with anger at the injustice of it all. Then Nathan, with the courage of his convictions, says to David, "You are that man." David quickly discovers that this story is an allegory about the injustice that he has brought upon Bathsheba and her family by having an affair and sending her husband Uriah into battle to try to cover it all up. While the allegory is compelling, it's not necessarily surprising that powerful people use violence to try to cover up their sins. What is unexpected about this story is how David responded to being exposed. He humbly repented. He didn't try to deny the action. He didn't try to kill Nathan, the messenger. He just simply and difficultly confessed his sins. David's remorseful response is encapsulated in a famous song known as Psalm 51, which begins like this: "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions, wash me thoroughly from my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin." David's response to Nathan's allegory is the best case scenario when it comes to sharing a revealing story. But this was clearly not the kind of response that Jesus got when he shared his allegory with the religious leaders in today's gospel reading. In Jesus' allegory about the vineyard and the landowner, the one to one correspondence is relatively easy to figure out. The landowner is God, the vineyard is Israel. The lease extended to the tenants represents the generations of descendants who occupy the land. The slaves of the landowner are the prophets of God who come to try to get Israel back on track, but are beaten, killed, and stoned by the ungrateful tenants. Into this mess comes the son, the one that the landowner hopes will get the kind of respect he deserves. The Son is none other than Jesus himself. With the arrival of the Son, the tenants see an opportunity. They don't want to give their income, even a portion of it, back to this landowner. So they devise a successful plot to kill the Son and to pocket the earnings. Now, this is much like a real life scenario that the Israelites would have been very familiar with. A landowner and tenants would have been a common occurrence in Israel, who had lived under the occupying powers of many nations over the years. They had quickly tired of giving to Caesar what was Caesar because, well, they believed that everything belonged to the king, to their king. But what they had quickly forgot was that everything belonged to that original landowner. Everything belongs to God. As Jesus concludes this allegory, he turns to the religious leaders who've been trying to catch him in a trick for several days, and he asks them, how does the owner of the vineyard get justice on these tenants? The religious leaders suggest more violence, saying, the landowner should kill those tenants and get some new ones who will treat the vineyard with respect. Now, it's important to note that the call for violence comes not from Jesus and not from the landowner in the allegory, but from the religious leaders themselves. Jesus is pointing to the core issue that has corrupted these religious leaders and other powerful leaders at large. They've come to believe a myth, the myth of redemptive violence. They think that the answer to violence is more violence, yet Jesus knows a deeper truth. His life mission is about demonstrating a different way of responding to violence, a way of living that produces the fruits of the kingdom: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, and self-control, also known as the fruits of the Spirit. The idea that violence can solve the problem of violence is a cornerstone belief of much of our society. Yet Jesus is building a new kingdom on a different cornerstone, on the way of nonviolent resistance and peacemaking. This is what Jesus is referring to when he quotes from Psalm 118, verse 22. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in our eyes. Jesus proclaims that his peaceful way of living is that stone that the builders rejected. And he's teaching a new way, demonstrating an enduring way to build a just society upon the peaceful, non-violent ways of the suffering servant. In retrospect, we can see the error of these tenants' ways. Violence has never really solved anything. But as current tenants of God's vineyard, how are we to respond to the injustice all around us? We know that we are suffering for both the ways of the current and former tenants who've aggressively used and abused this place. Their reliance on violence to dominate the other has led to the depletion of our civil society and our natural resources. Yet this violence is at the foundation of much of our society. It's how our nation was built, how our police systems are structured, and how our political machine is fueled. Aware of all these faulty foundations, what does society building look like in a nonviolent, peaceful way? Well, simply put, it looks like Jesus. It looks like Jesus, who, in the face of an impressive tax system, which priced out the poor from the worship of God, he turned over tables, disrupting the money changers, the oppressors of the day. It looks like Jesus inviting the blind and the lame, those who had been excluded from the temple for generations, to stand front and center and be healed in his presence. It looks like Jesus, who, after being unjustly accused of blasphemy, responds to those violent attacks against him by doing just what he taught, by turning the other cheek, by giving his extra away, and by going that extra mile, all the way through the cross of Calvary and to the redemption of all through the resurrection. The good news of Jesus is that the future of the vineyard does not belong to the politically powerful, to the rich and famous, or even to the religious elite, but rather it belongs to the last, to the least, and to the left out. As Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, the future belongs to the spiritually bankrupt, to the mourners, the meek, and the merciful, to those who yearn for justice, those who are purely motivated peacemakers, and those who are persecuted for doing what is right. So may you and I be open to this kind of counter-cultural response to violence as we embrace the way of Jesus. And in doing so, may we find the fruits of the Spirit filling us, pouring out of us to others, and expanding this peaceful kingdom, making the world a better place, both now and for eternity. Amen.